So for this module, we're going to focus on the social justice topic of racism. Now, I know that this can be a sensitive issue and one that can be more uncomfortable to dive into than perhaps ageism or ableism. However, it's a really important topic for us to be willing to explore as honorary social workers, or for those of you who are considering going into the field of social work, as racism influences the lives of the people that we stand with and that we work with in many, many ways. So I'm going to ask you as you work through this, if you need to take breaks and pause the video, that's okay. But really be willing to be open to really exploring this and really reflecting on the types of privilege that you have and the types of privilege that you don't have, based on race, as well as some of the other intersections in terms of gender, sexual orientation, ability, and things like that. To start, I'd like you to reflect on this question. How do you feel when you think about discussing race, privilege, and your own related personal experiences? Does the idea of discussing this and thinking about this make you uncomfortable? Why do you think that is? So take a few minutes and just pause the video and really think about this and reflect on it in your journal. Now, for many of us, discussing or thinking about racism and privilege can be pretty uncomfortable. It's not something that we tend to be brought up being comfortable with discussing or reflecting on. It can be uncomfortable to think about the privilege and advantages that we have. And that's okay to be uncomfortable. What we really want to do, though, is, as particularly social workers, is be willing to lean into that discomfort. After all, that's how we grow, and that's how we help our clients grow. So though you don't have all the answers, or you may not have a lot of comfort discussing privilege and racism, that's okay, as long as you're willing and open to working on that. As a white woman, it's taken me time to come to terms with my privilege, in particular my white privilege. It's something that I've had to work on over the years, and it hasn't been easy, but it's been worth the work. It's been worth it in terms of recognizing, particularly we're going to talk about microaggressions later, but recognizing how terminology or words that I use can empower people or disempower people, depending on the words that I use. How the language that I use can really hurt somebody's dignity and self-esteem, or how it can build it up. And so it's important as we work through this module to really be willing to explore our own assumptions, our own discomfort, because that's what's really going to help us grow. And that's what's going to help you long term, whether you choose to be a social worker or not, in whatever profession you go into, being willing to push yourself to deal with, particularly when it comes to racism and addressing it in society, but being willing to recognize areas and things that make you uncomfortable and be willing to reflect on that and to work through that will help you as you develop as a person and as a professional throughout your life. So as we move forward through this e-class and through the rest of the semester, I want you to keep these things in mind. First, we have to start where we are. Now, this is a term that's kind of drilled into us as social workers, that we need to start where the client's at, right? We can't start, where we want them to be. We have to start with what they present us with. And that's really the same for us, right? We have to start where we're at. So wherever you are in terms of your comfort with discussing racism, with discussing privilege, that's okay. Because as long as we're willing to acknowledge it and to start working to address it, right? So we've got to start where we are. And the reason why we're all at different levels is because racism's not just a problem of personal prejudices and individual acts of discrimination. It's interwoven into our society in terms of our social institutions, our political institutions, our economic institutions. Racism is interwoven into our history and society and our culture as Americans. And so we're really in many ways, particularly those of us who are white, are born into a society that advantages some races over others, and that is largely uncomfortable with talking about race or reflecting on how different races, different ethnicities have different levels of privilege and power. So the intention of raising our own consciousness and that of others, it's not to incite shame, guilt, or blame. So we should, again, if you felt uncomfortable with a point to ponder, don't feel guilty about that. Don't feel shame. Recognize that a big reason why we feel uncomfortable when we talk about race and privilege is because we're often socialized within our culture to be uncomfortable about talking about it or to avoid talking about it. But the more we talk about racism, the more we talk about some of the other isms and social justice issues we're going to talk about throughout the semester, the more we can be comfortable with unpacking our privilege, the privilege of others, how we can improve our vocabulary and our understanding so that we can raise consciousness and we can bring about action and social justice. So to really bring about those actions in social justice, we've got to work not only on ourselves, but the larger system. Because the larger system is what really kind of makes us uncomfortable talking about the isms to begin with. So as we continue to explore social justice topics, and particularly racism, it's important that we understand some of the terminology. So first, we're going to start with racism, and in this class, this is defined as prejudiced thoughts and discriminatory actions based on differences in race and/or ethnicity, or perceptions of race and/or ethnicity. And it's usually by white European groups against people of color. And racism, like homophobia, ranges from dislike and avoidance of particular racial groups to discrimination in employment, all the way to violent and aggressive acts. And racism can express itself through subtle actions, which we're going to particularly talk about in this class in terms of microaggressions. So the everyday language that we use can actually really be a form of racism and can perpetuate racial stereotypes. And we also see racism, or we're more familiar with racism often in terms of the more aggressive or direct actions that are taken against a specific race. So we often see it in terms of police killings or videos of different groups doing racist chanting or things like that. It's important to recognize that racism isn't just carried out by an individual or group of individuals. There's also the issue of institutional racism, which is the manifestation of racism in social systems and institutions. So it's in our social, economic, educational, and political forces or policies that really operate to foster discriminatory outcomes. It's the combination of policies, practices, or procedures that are embedded in our bureaucratic structures that systematically lead to unequal outcomes for different groups of people. So examples of this could be in terms of if we look at differences in terms of race amongst the population that's incarcerated in the US. For example, black men are 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than white men, and African American women are 2 times more likely to be incarcerated than white women. We can also see it if we think about historically in the US in terms of the various policies that we've had over the years that have segregated populations based on race. So if we look at school segregation, the Jim Crow laws, and things like that. And even today, we still, though, for example, segregation has been outlawed, we can still see the history and the legacy of that. For example, if we were to look at maps of neighborhoods across the United States, which you can actually do if you go onto Google and type in racial segregation dot map, you can actually see a depiction using 2010 census data of how segregated many of our communities still are in terms of race. In particular, we see the segregation in terms of race, also in terms of income status. But for those of you who are particularly focusing on schools, for example, The racial segregation of neighborhoods, if you look at the lower income or the less affluent schools, these are often in these neighborhoods that tend to have been racially segregated and that are predominantly people of color. So for your projects, you may actually want to look into that and include some of that more historical information in your projects, because our point in time, racism just doesn't just exist in our society as it is now. It has a history that's been developed and interwoven into our society and our policies, formally and informally over the years. Now, the other terms we also want to be familiar with are privilege. This could be privilege in terms of race, gender, socioeconomic status. This is just a general term. So this is the unearned advantage, right, or immunity that gives certain groups economic, social, and political advantages in society. Now, I know the term unearned advantage can kind of make you feel uncomfortable. What we really mean by this is think about it in terms of groups or individuals who are born into more affluent families than others. For example, I come from an upper middle class family. I didn't do anything to earn the advantages that came with being born into that family. For example, my parents being able to afford for us to play soccer, to be on swim teams and things like that when we were kids. That's an unearned advantage for me. And so if we think about privilege, trying to unpack our uncomfortableness around that, if we're really going to explore racism and privilege, is to really think about it in terms of, this isn't a knock against us. When we talk about our unearned advantages, this is really to say that, some of us have had more privilege or more advantages than others. And in order to really combat racism and start to take down these social justice issues or injustices, we really need to, as individuals, become more comfortable with exploring our own privileges and how we can use our privilege in order to help others. So, for example, how I can use my education, how I can use my kind of status as an educated white woman to push for policies in Wilmington that would be advantageous to everyone. All right, and that ties then into white privilege, which is the collection of benefits based on belonging to a group perceived to be white, when the same or some similar benefits are denied to members of other groups. So again, this is thinking about it in terms, for me in particular, as a white woman, I have many advantages that a woman of color doesn't have. I've never been followed around in a store. Nobody's ever assumed that I would be robbing the store just based solely on my race or the appearance of my race. One of my good friends, we were discussing this actually the other day, and she was telling me a story or explaining things to me. She is a Latina woman, and during the summer, she gets treated very differently because when she's out in the sun and is more tanned, she very clearly looks more Latina. In the winter, when she hasn't been in the sun because she's in Kansas and the winters are awful there, she can pass as white. And so she gets treated differently in the winter, whether it be shopping or interactions with strangers and things like that, than she does in the summer. So again, that's an example of white privilege. Now, many of you may have heard of this term, colorblindness, and some people say it as I don't actually like that. So we talked about racism and institutional racism, and these are really, particularly racism tends to be, we think about it in terms of the more obvious examples that we see, whether it be in the news, particularly with what we're seeing constantly in the media in terms of particularly a white person calling the cops on a person of color for doing kind of an everyday thing. We can all tend to recognize that those have racist intentions or racism is present in that situation. However, it's also important to recognize that microaggressions, which are really more subtle, is another form of racism. And so microaggressions are the everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slight snubs or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely upon their marginalized group membership. And so this could be in terms of language that we use. It can also be unintentional reactions to situations. So, for example, you've probably heard of stories where a white woman will pick up her purse when an African American or person of color walks by, and she may not really even be thinking about it. It may be totally unconscious. And again, that's an example of how we're kind of socialized into these more kind of racist attitudes. It could be totally unintentional, just a reflex reaction, but it's actually infused with racism, right? She wouldn't necessarily pick up her purse if a white individual had walked by. And so the person of color can see that and recognizes that this person who, they don't know each other, based solely upon skin color, feels less safe or is concerned that this person may steal from them, again, based solely on race. Now, it's important to recognize, as we'll look in the slides, the next slide, microaggressions can also be to other marginalized groups. We're talking about them mostly in terms of racism today and in this module, but it's also important to recognize, so if we look back in terms of ageism and ableism, calling somebody a crotchety older adult, that's a microaggression. If we think about it in terms of the environment, so areas that are less physically accessible, that's actually a microaggression for people who use wheelchairs or other assistive devices if they can't access those areas. So it's important to recognize microaggressions, particularly in terms of racism, but also how microaggressions may influence or be part of all of the isms that we're going to talk about throughout this semester. So let's look at a few examples of microaggressions. So when we think about microaggressions, we want to think about it particularly kind of in terms of the message or the perception that the person may have who is really being targeted or who experiences that microaggression. So in many cases, people aren't actually intending to be offensive, right? You're trying to be supportive or you're curious, you want to get to know the person better. But what we say can be taken to be offensive or to be kind of hurt the dignity and worth of that person. So, for example, asking someone where they're from, if they appear to be of Asian descent or Latina or Latino or of another culture, asking them where they're born, saying things like, you speak good English. I mean, individuals may mean that as a compliment, but that can actually be taken as being quite offensive to an individual because especially if they've been born and raised in the United States, they see themselves as an American. English may in fact be their primary language, but asking that and assuming that they don't know that, or making assumptions about the person just based on their physical appearance and then acting that out through words or physical actions are examples of microaggressions. So even things that could be taken or that somebody might mean as a compliment, you're a credit to your race. The message that the person of color may be getting from that is that people of color are generally not as intelligent as whites, or it's unusual for someone of your race to be as intelligent, right? So we have to think about what we say and what the intent of the message is, and how it might be perceived by a person of color or a person from another marginalized group. And what's, I think, particularly important and particularly challenging when we're not members of those marginalized groups is that it's really important for us to be willing to put aside our defensiveness. We may not be meaning to be offensive, right? We may have meant to pay them a compliment or that we wanted to get to know them better. But we need to open up ourselves and open up that space to recognizing that what we said may have hurt this other person. And we need to understand that their perception of this is what really matters in this encounter, right? They're trying to tell us that what we're saying or how we're acting is hurtful to them, and we need to be willing to listen to that and acknowledge that. So to finish up, I'd like you to watch this TED Talk on microaggressions and how microaggressions are kind of interwoven in our society. And as you watch it, I want you to ponder these questions. When have you experienced a microaggression in your life? When have you committed a microaggression? So think about all your intersecting identities, be it in terms of race, gender, ethnicity, age, socioeconomic status, and think about when people have said things that are really not about you, but about their perception of you in terms of being a white man or of being lower income or higher income, things like that. Again, you can watch this TED Talk by clicking on the link, the iCard link, or you can close out this presentation and go to the TED Talk in your Canvas file. So I'd like to see in your journal reflections some of your discussion of this TED Talk and what was particularly interesting for you about her presentation.